early Romantics, or first-generation Romantics. These poets wrote from 1780s to 1810s. Noteworthy poets include Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake. I will be talking about all of them in this lecture. Starting with Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is known as the Bard of Rydal Mount. Rydal Mount is a house in the small village of Rydal family, which is known for being the home of William Wordsworth. Wordsworth was England's poet laureate from 1813 till his death, after which he was succeeded by Alfred Lord Tennyson. His notable works are The Prelude, which was published 3 months later of his death by his wife Mary, and Lyrical Ballads, published in 1798, a joint work with Coleridge. He was heavily influenced by Rousseau, as both him and Rousseau considered that the evils of modern life stemmed from man's separation from nature. He therefore made a fervent plea for a return to nature and wanted through his poetry to re-establish a spiritual kinship between man and nature, and thus to restore humanity to the glory and dignity which they had lost under the increasing impact of Industrial Revolution. Romanticism is therefore described as a return to nature and the renaissance of wonder. For Wordsworth, nature was a teacher and a god. His approach to nature was therefore pantheistic, that is, he spiritualized nature. He brought in the concept of the transcendental sublime, a belief that man can transcend the human through nature due to nature's power to induce intense emotions. I talk more about the transcendental sublime and other forms of sublime in my lecture on Romanticism, which you can find here. Wordsworth's love for nature evolved through 4 stages. Stage 1, the sensory stage, where you see the boisterous delight of childhood. As a child, Wordsworth experiences nature with pure joy. He enjoys outdoor activities like skating, climbing trees, and rowing boats. Nature is a source of physical pleasure, but he does not yet understand its deeper meanings. An example of this is the stolen boat episode in the Prelude, where he rows a boat and is suddenly struck with awe at the looming mountains. Stage 2 is the moral stage, which sees the adolescent awe and fear. In adolescence, he sees nature as something vast and mysterious, evoking feelings of both awe and fear. For example, his encounter with the precipice in the Prelude, where nature's grandeur humbles him. Stage 3 is the intellectual and spiritual bond of adulthood. As he matures, nature becomes his teacher and moral guide, shaping his thoughts and emotions. For example, in his poem The Tintern Abbey, he reflects on how nature has given him serene and blessed mood in times of trouble. Stage 4, the pantheistic realization, or the philosophical stage. In later years, his love for nature takes on a pantheistic dimension. He sees God in nature. He believes that nature and the divine are intertwined, and nature itself embodies a universal spirit as described in Tintern Abbey. There is a preordained harmony between nature and human mind. For example, in the Prelude, he describes nature as the soul of all his moral being. Wordsworth's attitude to nature can be clearly differentiated from that of other great poets of nature. He did not prefer the wild and stormy aspects of nature like Byron, or the changeful aspects of nature like Shelley, or the purely sensuous in nature like Keats. Rather, he preferred nature in her ordinary, familiar, everyday moods. He believed that nature was a being which pervades the universe and moves all thinking things and all objects of all thought. This was his pantheism, the identification of God with nature, which was anti-Christian. As Wordsworth advanced in age and his revolutionary fervor declined into the sober light of orthodoxy, he began to re-examine the early version of the Prelude in order to make its doctrine more comfortable to the Christian sentiment. The pantheistic message in the Prelude, therefore, is immediately followed by verses which place God, the uncreated, above and beyond his creation, as the creator of nature, so that the objects of nature are made to look up to him and sing the song, of thanks and glorification of his mercy and might. He looked at nature as the mystic of the old days, reading the page of holy writings. So an essentially Wordsworthian feature of his treatment of nature is not just seeing it as ordinary, but also seeing it as intensely spiritual. And the basic principle of his doctrine is the unity of man and nature as the partakers in the one and same life, which meant a preordained harmony between the two. In his preface, Wordsworth gave the theory of poetry. His definition of poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. When Wordsworth says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, it is clear that poetry is a matter of mood and inspiration. Poetry evolves from the feelings of the poet. His insistence on spontaneity doesn't mean that Wordsworth advocates for chaotic or uncontrolled frenzy of emotional outpouring. Poetry is spontaneous in a way that it is spontaneously an emotion recollected in tranquility. At first glance, the two contentions seem contradictory, but Wordsworth's theory of poetry evolved the reconciliation of the two statements. Powerful feelings and profound thoughts collapse in poetry. To understand this better, we have to understand Wordsworth's poetic process. His poetic process has 4 stages. These stages are: 1. Recollection. In tranquility, the poet will recall his emotions. 2. Contemplation. The emotions are made into a poem with the help of images of those things in nature which aroused the poet's emotion in the first place. 3. Renewal of the original emotion, which he calls recrudescence. The poet does not react to impress immediately. He allows these recollections to sink into his mind, along with the feeling with which it has excited. This is felt by the poet originally, but he cannot remember the original experience in cold blood, as it were. In the poet's mind, the emotion which accompanied the original is recalled. Now that he has recalled it, here comes stage 4, composition. The poet's function is to share the joy with his readers, to communicate this overbalance of pleasure of nature to his audience. The poet is able to do this precisely because he possesses the power of communication to a higher degree than other men. I will talk more about this when I talk about primary and secondary imagination of Coleridge. The poet is able to communicate his emotions in such a way that the readers feel pleasure. The end of poetry is to impart pleasure. Pleasure is the grand elementary principle which makes a man feel, live, move, gain knowledge. In fact, we feel sympathy because through sympathy we get pleasure. Even the painful and pathetic elements of life must be so communicated that it would be productive of pleasure. Poetic pleasure is of a deeper and more beautiful kind. For poetry, it is the breath and finer spirits of all knowledge. Therefore, Wordsworth's conception of poetic pleasure is an exalted one. The aim of poetry is to give pleasure through the medium of beauty. Equally exalted is his conception of the poet, who is to communicate the joy and the overbalance of pleasure through poetry. A poet must also have sensibility as well as powerful feelings, and he should be able to express himself very differently as compared to a normal person. According to Wordsworth, the poet should not sit at a superior height. He is a man among other men, and he speaks to his fellow men the way his fellow men speak to themselves. You see, Wordsworth was seeking to revolutionize poetry by moving away from artificial poetic diction and classical conventions. He rejected the highly decorative, elaborate language of neoclassical poetry, the kind that Alexander Pope used, in favor of the real language of men. He believed that poetry should reflect the speech of common people, particularly those living in rustic and rural settings, where emotions are more authentic and closer to nature. That is the reason why he believed that the child is the father of man in his work, My Heart Leaps Up. This phrase suggests that a person's childhood experiences, emotions, and habits shape their adult identity. In other words, what we become as adults is rooted in who we are as children. Wordsworth believed that there's a profound connection between childhood and nature. Childhood is the time of innocence and wonder, where a person's fundamental character and outlook on life are formed. If a child grows up with a deep appreciation for nature, beauty, and joy, these qualities will carry into adulthood. So childhood holds a kind of wisdom and purity that adulthood often loses, and therefore the child becomes the father of man. This kind of child would grow up to become a poet. The poet would be the man speaking to men, but one with greater sensitivity, imagination, and insight. The lyrical ballad was written with the purpose of showing how the common objects or characters could be made to appear in an unusual light by throwing over them a coloring of the imagination. Wordsworth felt that the subject of poetry had been for too long restricted to the upper society. He wanted to extend the range of poetic subjects. He felt that the universal elements of human nature, which a poet sought to express in his poetry, were found in a purer and simpler state in the rustic and common people. The advocacy of going to the common and rustic folk for subject matter of poetry naturally gave rise to preference for language used by people. Since Coleridge and Wordsworth wrote the preface together, they have certain similarities when it comes to their philosophy towards nature. But the one thing that differs between both of them is the transcendental philosophy of Coleridge and that of Wordsworth. For Coleridge, nature is made alive by the mind of man, and the object becomes one with the subject. It is philosophic monism. But for Wordsworth, his doctrine is based on dualism, that the entities of mind and nature are wedded together, but they're not fully identified as one. Each of them retains their separate strength to modify and color the other. While the transcendental philosophy of Wordsworth is called transcendental sublime, the transcendental philosophy of Coleridge is called transcendental unity. That imagination is a transcendental force that binds everything into a unified whole. It unifies perception, or your dreams, and reality through a higher, almost mystical synthesis. To make it easier, let's understand it through an example. In his work Kubla Khan, the river Alf, the pleasure dome, and the supernatural elements don't just exist separately. They're bound together through the poet's imagination, creating a transcendental unity, a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Different images come together to create something which they're individually not. Not only in case of the transcendental, but Coleridge also differed from Wordsworth on his poetic theory. Coleridge engages with Wordsworth's ideas from the preface to lyrical ballads, particularly Wordsworth's claim that poetry should use the language of ordinary people. Coleridge disagreed that poetry should strictly adhere to diction of common people. Instead, Coleridge argues that poetic language should be elevated by imagination, transcending mere conventional speech while remaining natural and expressive. While Wordsworth was primarily influenced by the French Revolution and French philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was more influenced by German ideals, particularly Kant and Schelling, who argued that reality is shaped by the mind. Unlike the rationalists of the Enlightenment, Coleridge believed in subjective experience and poetic insight as the highest forms of knowledge. While Wordsworth found truth in ordinary nature, Coleridge explored mysticism and supernatural. So for him, nature was Gothic imagery, dream visions, and symbolism to explore the mysteries of the human mind, like you see in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Coleridge's poetry also delved into psychology and the unconscious mind. He was fascinated by the fragmented self, the idea that humans are often in conflict with their own desires and emotions. You can see that very well in his work Christabel. His poetry often portrays dreamlike states, hallucinations, and visions, making him a precursor to modern psychological literature. Finally, we look at one of his most important contributions to Romanticism: primary and secondary imagination and the concept of fancy. Primary imagination is the unconscious ability of human mind to perceive and make sense of the world. It is universal, common to all people. It is the basis of the human experience. Secondary imagination is a more refined, artistic, and transformative faculty unique to poets and creative mind. It actively reshapes and recreates reality, allowing poets to elevate ordinary experiences into profound artistic expressions. Fancy, unlike imagination, is a lower mechanical faculty that merely arranges and resembles existing images without true creative transformation. It lacks the unifying power of imagination that we learned in transcendental unity, and fancy is primarily decorative rather than deeply meaningful. Now, just like Wordsworth would describe poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, Coleridge would describe poetry as the union of form and meaning, guided by imagination. For him, poetry is an organic and living entity which is evolving naturally rather than being constrained by rigid rules. Let's now move on to William Blake. He believed that poetry is supposed to be something mystical, which is blending religion, visionary experience, and radical social critique. He saw human imagination as divine, believing that creativity was a form of prophecy. I say that his poetry is mystical because he often claimed to have visions of angels and spirits which influenced his work. His poetry and paintings are filled with mythical figures like Urizen, who is the symbol of reason and oppression, and Orc, which is the symbol of revolution and energy. In his works like Songs of Innocence and Experience, he contrasts childlike purity and innocence with corruption of society experience, showing how industrialization and institutionalized religion destroy the human spirit. He famously declared that I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. Blake was also a radical critic of social injustice. In fact, he believed that poet is a social critic. Blake condemned the exploitation of children in poems like The Chimney Sweeper, attacking the hypocrisy of institutions that claimed to be moral while oppressing the poor. He viewed organized religion as corrupt, believing that true spirituality was found in personal vision and artistic expression. His famous quote, "Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion," reflect his belief that laws and institutions often serve oppression rather than justice. Blake's central idea was dualism, the idea that reality is shaped by opposing forces, light and dark, innocence and experience, good and evil. However, unlike traditional Christian theology, he did not see these opposites as absolute. Instead, he believed that progress came from their interaction. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he suggests that energy, often labeled as evil by religion, is necessary for creation and progress. His line, "Without contraries is no progression," captures this philosophy very well. So this was all about William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth. We covered 3 of the most important Lake poets. In my next lecture on the Romantics, I will be covering the later Romantics, which includes Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats.